Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Don Zimmerman from NetApp, and I'm pleased to represent NetApp and TechNet and AFCEA as the sponsor of Theater 3. And this morning, we're here to talk about JADC2, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control. Our moderator is Colonel Finch, Kevin Finch, U.S. Army, and our panelists include Ms. Caroline Bean, Mr. Jim Fowler, Dr. Brian Herman, Colonel Andre Johnson, U.S. Air Force, Ms. Caroline Kuharski, and Mr. Dickie Rosenville. NetApp is pleased to sponsor the Theater 3 panels, just as DISA is transforming itself into a software-focused service provider. So NetApp has already made that transition itself, especially by uniquely providing a unification to the multi-cloud environment, being able to move data and virtualized applications without refactoring from cloud to cloud, from any data source. Our moderator, Colonel Finch, is the Deputy Director for the Acquisition, Digital Capabilities, and Security Center, as well as the DISA JADC2 lead. He began as an artillery officer after graduating from West Point in '95 and held leadership roles at Fort Hood and Fort Lewis, deploying with CENTCOM and Operation Iraqi Freedom as a warranted brigade contracting officer. He has expertise in both tactical operations and in contracting, and was awarded the Army Acquisition Executives 06 level PM Team of the Year 3 years ago. And last year, the Association of Old Crows awarded him the 2021 Stanley B. Hall Executive Management Award. With him on the panel is Ms. Caroline Bean, who's the Director for the Joint Enterprise Services Directorate, and she previously was Program Director for DEOS and MilCloud 2. Mr. Jim Fowler is the Chief Engineer of the C2 portfolio that coordinates DISA's C2 efforts with the DoD's Joint C2 and future JADC2 efforts. Dr. Brian Herman is the Program Executive Officer and the Director of DISA's Cybersecurity and Analytics Directorate, leading the acquisition, development, and technology insertion of cybersecurity and network operations from the enterprise to the endpoint. Colonel Andre Johnson, U.S. Air Force, is the Director of the Joint Spectrum Center, or JSC, at DISA, where he provides enterprise electromagnetic spectrum tools, capabilities, services, data, and end E3 spectrum and applied engineering to the DoD. Ms. Caroline Kuharski is DISA's Chief Data Officer, where she identifies, prioritizes, and executes data and analytics initiatives aligned to DISA's enterprise strategies. And Mr. Dickie Rosenville is the Chief for Transport Service Plans Branch in DISA's Transport Services Directorate, orchestrating the resourcing and sustainment activities required to evolve the global network infrastructure to support the DoD. Those are our panelists, and our moderator today is Colonel Kevin Finch. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude the opening keynote session.
All right, come on up here, Jim. Hey, good morning, everybody. Don, thank you for the warm introduction, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our JADC2 session today. I'd like to thank my esteemed panel members for joining me today as we discuss JADC2 and really transition from the what to the how. These experts and their organizations they represent will be the ones who deliver, with industry help, of course, the enterprise capabilities to make JADC2 a reality. My assumption is most of you already know what JADC2 is or heard of JADC2. In short, JADC2's ask is for a warfighting capability to sense and then make sense and act at the speed of relevance. The JADC2 why is threefold. The pace of warfare is increasing, the volume and complexity of data is overwhelming, and most importantly, victory goes to those who have the decision advantage. Well, what do we have now? I've heard some describe our legacy capabilities as stovepipes of excellence, where they lack data-centric design and the ability to effectively share information with other critical warfighting functions. In many cases, APIs made by Swivel Chair Incorporated, networks made possible by your favorite sneaker manufacturer, have allowed these stovepipes to function with each other. The human in this loop is very undesirable. the human delays and possibly corruption of the data needed to provide the commander with decision advantage. What is needed is for these stovepipes to be turned into puzzle pieces where we can share how the pieces fit together. Next slide. I guess that's me. Let me see. All right. Okay. Some disclaimer there. Please read that. All right. The envisioned JADC2 foundational pillars and core enablers are expected to allow an end state of capabilities to effectively share data. I'll quickly list the pillars and enablers for your reference, and our panel will discuss many of them as I wanted to highlight them so you can understand why this has an important role to play in JADC2. The foundational pillars are being operationally focused, open architectures, enterprise services, data centricity, agnostic systems, digital engineering and service integrated with DevSecOps, cross-domain services, adaptation of containerized microservices, and security. The core enablers, which many of our panel members are actively involved in, is identity, credential and access management, better known as ICAM, zero trust, cloud services, transport and network services, data services, development, security, and operations, DevSecOps, mission partner environment, and secret and below releasable environment. Over the next hour, we're going to discuss many of the envisioned JADC2 core enablers and foundational pillars, which could turn the what into the how. The chart here is broken down into enterprise services, regional services, and edge services, which is a lot easier to put on one chart than it is to achieve in reality. JADC2 goal is simple to understand and articulate, but the solution, or abruptly the solutions, present many challenges which DoD will have to leverage industry expertise. Next slide. That's me again. All right. Recently, the Deputy Secretary of Defense signed a JADC2 implementation plan, which has 5 lines of effort. This has equities in many of these lines of efforts and serves as the lead or co-lead for multiple subtasks in the JADC2 effort. This has expertise and equities in many JADC2 focus areas for planning, which include data, transport, C2, the electromagnetic spectrum, enterprise services, and cybersecurity. There are currently working groups and collaboration going on across DoD to chart the path forward. Next slide. That's me again. I keep on forgetting that. All right. Okay. So now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Herman here to my left, and he's going to give us some insight into the cybersecurity efforts that he's currently working on.
Thank you, Colonel Finch. So I want to talk about some capabilities that will help us enable the entire JADC2 effort, but I'm actually very glad to see kind of the cross-section of DISA and what we all contribute to making JADC2 a reality. If you're as old as I am, you might remember an old BASF commercial where they said we're not the company that you think of all the time, but we make those products better. So DISA is behind the scenes in a lot of cases enabling JADC2, but also delivering capabilities that are actually in the hands of warfighters as well, that you'll hear about especially from the Spectrum and Command and Control portfolio teams. So in the space of Zero Trust and ICAM, the first thing that you have to have in order to effectively collaborate with allied and coalition partners is an understanding of who you're working with. And so DoD is in the process of embarking on our ICAM journey. The first piece of that, and I was extremely happy to hear General Skinner say it yesterday, is that ICAM is a federation of capabilities. There's an enterprise service that is the enterprise level data and attributes about an individual that we know of, and sometimes that's enhanced with additional attributes that are locally important, and also we clearly understand that sometimes it's important to have a capability that's in place in a tactical space or shipboard to make sure that if you're disconnected from the enterprise, you can still have functionality and understand who you're working with, but synchronize to the maximum extent when possible. So we have to have this federation of ICAM services so that we can understand what Brian has access to in terms of data and applications as I go throughout my workday, and understand whether the behavior that I'm exhibiting is in some way anomalous. The first key is to understand who it is and what permissions they ought to have. That's ICAM. So the next piece of that, though, the department has been working very closely with federal partners. We don't fight alone, but we also sometimes include the other elements of the federal government. So we're bringing together federal PIV capabilities to allow federal partners to be part of DoD applications where it makes sense. But most importantly and most relevant for JADC2 is bringing together allied and coalition partners so that we can understand who we're working with. And that is a much tougher challenge. So it's easy to trust inside of DoD. It's a little bit harder, but definitely possible to trust inside the federal government. It's a much more challenging problem to trust who we are working with when it's an allied partner or a coalition partner. Maybe I'll say allied easier, coalition much harder, because those tend to be ad hoc. And so in some sense, we need to have some DoD policy and federal policy that will allow us to have that trust and establish under what conditions we will have that trust. But fundamentally, the technology, the capability that we're putting in place to identify individuals, to provide automated account provisioning, and to provide that master user record that gives that total picture of what we have available is the same. It just needs to be extending that trust out, which is where we connect up with the mission partner environment and the MPCO that's working this problem from the Air Force perspective. So I said, ICAM and Zero Trust are enablers for JADC2. Well, ICAM is actually an enabler for Zero Trust as well. So it's kind of a stacked, nested doll, if you will. So Zero Trust says, first you have to know who you're working with, and secondly, where are they coming from? What's the status of their device? So we have things like Comply to Connect that'll identify this is a managed device, it's been properly patched, it's coming from a trusted IP address, etc. Or this is not a managed device, it is, but the individual has a CAC, and we'll give them less trust. And so I think Zero Trust is a tough concept, because getting there is probably never actually attainable, but getting close enough is attainable. And so that's what we're going for, and it will be a phased effort. So the way that we're doing that within DISA is a project that you've heard of called Thunderdome, probably. So Thunderdome is right now piloting some technologies that we think get after the Zero Trust pillars, and we do it first in a lab environment, and then we move that to the production environment for operational assessment and testing. So we will assess it at DISA at Fort Meade. We'll do it at the Pentagon, and we're going to do it out in Indo-PACOM as well. We're looking to add a fourth site potentially, so that we can partner again with one of our service partners that are doing some additional effort. So we are already partnering with the Air Force in that space as they're doing similar things. And the reason for that partnership is to ensure that we understand not only what are the best capabilities that are out there, but whether those capabilities are interoperable. And by interoperable, what I'm asking for is can I ensure that I don't need to put multiple capabilities on the desktop of end users that will cause performance problems? Can I make sure that I achieve all the goals of microsegmentation as well as QoS that we get from SD-WAN, even though the department's network topology is very complicated with a backbone and a connection to the separate networks that are in the services as well. So we're partnering with them, and the point of that evaluation is to pick a set of promising technologies that we will implement throughout the agency. And like the panel that you have here, we're not going to have a small Thunderdome program executing all of this. We're going to evaluate the capabilities as an agency, and we are going to implement them as an agency. So we will spin out capabilities to the infrastructure team so that they can run the transport piece. Of course, the transport piece is merging significantly with the cybersecurity infrastructure as we bring those two capabilities together. But the idea is that DISA is going to implement Zero Trust on our terrain. That is the DISN backbone, and that is the DoD net capabilities that we provide for ourselves and the Fourth Estate. And we're going to share that capability with the services so that together we can have a solid solution that we can implement. And the way that we synchronize those activities is through the Zero Trust Portfolio Management Office out of the DoD CIO, where we keep tabs on what's going on in the services, and they understand what we're doing, but we can't slow down the train of implementation of Zero Trust. And the last thing I'd like to leave you with on that piece is that this will be a minimum viable product when we release it. It will not be perfect. Our goal with interoperability is to be able to have those puzzle pieces that we can add additional capabilities over time, because the worst thing that you can do from a cybersecurity perspective is to expect things to remain static over time as the threats change.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Herman. Next, we're going to have Caroline Bean. Yeah. You got your thing. There you go.
All right. Good morning. So I have the enterprise services portfolio, and so a lot of what we're doing is really at the enterprise service level is how can we deliver enterprise services with the foundational of JADC2 and the concept that we're trying to do. And so a lot of what we're doing is making sure that we're looking at some of our denied, disconnected, our low bandwidth, intermittent aspect, and we're not thinking of that as an afterthought with enterprise services, but we're thinking of it from the very beginning, because we need to do things differently with getting things out in the tactical. This situation in Ukraine has made this more evident that we need to do the information sharing, and we need to do that, and we need to be able to mobilize some of our enterprise services. So that's really a lot of what we're looking at, especially as we're evolving our enterprise service capabilities. And then a lot of the line of efforts that we hit kind of span throughout of our enterprise services to make sure that we're kind of doing that data sharing across the board. So.
Oh, great. Thank you. So next we're going to talk a little bit about data with our DISA Chief Data Officer, Ms. Caroline Kaskarski. And I will say data is probably, as we talk about JADC2, line of effort one is data.
Yeah.
And I will say that this is basically the blood that's going to make JADC2 work. So from that perspective, it's probably one of our most important topics.
So no pressure, right?
No pressure.
Yeah, it's all right.
No pressure.
I mean, he hit the nail right on the head, right? Data is going to be the lifeline for how JADC2 works and how we're going to be able to appropriately provide that much needed asset to those C2 decision makers so that they know exactly what they need to be doing and where they need to be doing it. The idea of JADC2, normalizing massive amounts of data from all different platforms is what's going to really push this effort over the edge and make it a success. The collaboration with all these different entities, like they keep saying, it's going to really revolutionize how we are exploiting data, how we are treating data, how we are evolving our data hygiene across the department. And the streamlining and correlation of that valuable C2 data is really the focal point. So ensuring that the transport is up and operational, what they're doing with where they're integrated in, and then those services and the trust factor, that's all needing to be embedded in the data from the beginning, right? Instead of having that data hygiene as an afterthought whenever we start putting services in, it needs to be a thought at the very beginning. Where can we label things so that it goes to the appropriate areas? Where are we implementing the security within the data itself and not just at the different transport network application layers? So those are things that we're focusing on when it comes to the JADC2.
Great, thank you. As we talk about the data piece, and I will say the security, when you think about this, you think about enterprise services, and from the overall aspect, you have the three main things here that this is really focusing on. First, with the cybersecurity piece that Dr. Herman's discussing. The second is the enterprise solutions, which this is known for, and third is the data piece. And so there is one thing that it has I will tell you from my previous experience, is the EMS is now being recognized not as a domain, but as a critical enabler to everything that we do. And from that perspective, JADC2, whenever you read JADC2, they talk about all the operational domains plus the EMS. And so with that, DISA has a very important role in JADC2 and the fact that we are actually in charge of leading the EMS architecture topic and really setting that up. And so we're lucky today to have Colonel Johnson with us, who's going to talk about EMBM and that EMS architecture.
So to kind of level set on our contribution to JADC2, I'd first like to cover what we do from a perspective in the Joint Spectrum Center. We're nestled under the Defense Spectrum Organization. Mr. Chris Argo, who's out there watching me right now, so I better keep it straight. And our mission that we always like to just get out there is our mission is to deliver tools, capabilities, and expertise to solve tomorrow's EMS challenges today. And our vision is to provide our warfighters the freedom of action within the electromagnetic spectrum when and where needed. Now, JSC's primary responsibility and our support to that mission and vision is to ensure that we're providing joint spectrum expertise. And that's in garrison or abroad. Where needed, we want to get our folks out there to ensure that we're providing interference resolution to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Combat Command, and MILDEP missions as required. Secondly, we provide electromagnetic environmental effects and engineering analysis expertise. So what does that really mean, right? So one of the things we do is ensure that the survivability, spectrum survivability, those new capabilities that are coming into DoD. If you were listening during the EMS panel yesterday, you probably heard Mr. Tripper talk about the importance of baking in that EMS spectrum survivability because of the difficulty of trying to do that later, and really it's almost impossible. So our guys are involved in that process. We're linked into the JSIDS process to try and make sure we're putting out systems that are spectrum survivable. Additionally, we assure that there's no negative impact when we talk about our mobile service providers. When they're installing equipment on our various bases and DoD installations, we need to ensure that there is no interference or negative impacts of that spectrum equipment that's being installed in proximity to our various bases. Additionally, an important element is the fact that we provide DoD Joint Ordnance E3 program, or JORAD. We manage that program overall. So why is that important? That's really all about our weapons safety, ensuring that you don't have any spectrum or EMS inadvertent ordnance going off or for any various reasons. Probably the most important thing for this audience here today is the fact that we have two key programs of office that we're responsible for in the JSC. The first being the Global Information System, or GEMSIS. That's important because that's, we're talking data here at the table. Data is important for us as well in Spectrum because GEMSIS includes the Joint Spectrum Data Repository. That's essential to the repository we're going to use to help visualize those things in the EMS that are necessary. You can't visualize the things if the data is not appropriate. And it also includes the Joint Spectrum Interference Resolution online system. And last, and probably most important, is the Spectrum 21 system. That is a system that's been around for a long time, utilized by a number of our DoD and coalition partners, because it's the DoD's sole frequency allocation system. And so that's important. I mentioned that because there is no EMBM without GEMSIS, because we need the data that's important within that. And so it's important, and I always talk about those things together. But EMBM, Electromagnetic Battle Management, that is our primary contribution to JADC2. It is what I call the DoD's EMS flagship. And it's a flagship initiative because it's going to ensure our combat commanders, Joint Task Force, GEMSOCs, have the capability to enhance ops within their electromagnetic operational environment. And that's critical as we start to, as you said, increase the focus on the electromagnetic spectrum that is going to enable JADC2 overall. So again, I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along, but that's basically our introduction and our contribution to JADC2, but I wanted to share the baseline of that from our overall capabilities.
All right, thank you. And I will say, I think overall, DoD has definitely realized the importance of the EMS. You know, as especially as you start looking at all of the different systems that are using the EMS to transmit data, it's becoming a very critical thing that we have to be able to manage from a spectrum management perspective, and then also from an electronic warfare perspective. So it's we're making a lot of great strides. We have a lot of great capabilities in the field, but systems like EMBM are going to be the thing that ties that all together in the future. And so thank you for your words, Colonel Johnson. Next, I have the pleasure of having Mr. Jim Fowler talk, and I will say, from a technical perspective, he is the go-to guy. I've had an opportunity to spend a lot of time with Jim, and I will say that, as we sit up here, right, you probably initially got the JADC2 brief, and you're like, wow, that's a really ambitious what they're trying to achieve with JADC2. And believe me, we do realize that, there are a lot of hard rocks that we have to push in order to realize JADC2 from a solution perspective, or more aptly put, a solutions perspective. But as people like Jim Fowler, who are actually the chief engineer for just the C2 portfolio, who has probably the best insight into how all of these different systems can be orchestrated and work together. And so I have the pleasure of letting him give his introduction before we get to Q&A.
Lead me on here and
You're
build
the
it up in such a
saver,
way
Jim.
that I can never build up to. No, basically, what I wanted to start out with is DISA has three major applications. One of them you've just heard about with EMBM. There are two others. I'm not sure you're familiar with one. One is GEECSJ, Global Command and Control System Joint, and the other is JOPS, the Joint Operational Planning and Execution System. They're both in the C2 portfolio under SD. Basically, to kind of describe it is, GEECSJ is that system up front that takes sensor data, whether that's high-speed sensor data from things like radar or lower speed information like imagery that comes in once a day or once a week, combines it together into what we call a common operational picture. That is really kind of the situational awareness view, that the COP view is what is distributed in multiple copies across the world so that we all know what's happening out there in the real world. And when we talk about the sense, make sense, and act loop from earlier, this is the sense portion, and that gives the people information. The make sense is not a DISA system, and it is basically humans. That's all the decision makers looking at that situational awareness picture and saying, what should I do next? Once they've made those decisions, then it's handed over to others, and this is where JOPS fits into. Hands it over to others and say, what do we need to do to plan to counter this situation? Now, in case of JOPS, we're only talking about a particular part of the full planning environment, and that is for all of the transcom types of work, moving equipment and material around the world to support combat and control. We don't do the kind of planning and execution that you talk about from the Air Combat Command and other kinds of commands out there that are actually working with the people and making the plans for doing that type of work. And then the execution portion is, JOPS is also part of that. So I just wanted to kind of set that stage and also give some history. GEECSJ and JOPS both have been around for at least a couple of decades. It is, I'm going to say it's kind of the basis for the command and control environment that we have today. Lots of different things that are being added to the C2 environment, lots of different ideas. As a matter of fact, JADC2 is another version of modernizing C2 in DoD. As a matter of fact, there's some jokes about it being the 13th or 14th try. But part of this is now we have what we have is a good high level DoD level governance structure over all of this. The pillars, the 5 LOEs from data, human, technical, nuclear command and control, and our mission partner environment. We have the strategy implementation plan that has been signed that is large, 60 or 70 pages. I don't remember exactly how many, and some very, very detailed. So we're getting guidance from the top down with people who are saying bottom up refinement so that we kind of now meet in the middle. So how does this all fit together? Data is very important. Instead of being independent systems with their own data, they're looking, how can we share data? How can we transform data into a format that everyone can use so that we remove the transformation as much as we can? How can we turn things into APIs so that we can communicate? How do we transport that data? And Dickie's going to talk about that more. I don't want to steal his thunder here. So how do we transport that information across the globe? How do we, the next thing is, how do we support it with enterprise systems? How do we support it with zero trust and ICAM? How do we make sure that access to those environments are for the people who are there? So that's kind of the introduction from the applications, the C2 perspective, and how DISA fits into JADC2.
Hey, thanks, Jim. And I will say, these are the systems that are really we talked earlier about data being the blood of JADC2. That's really what's going to make JADC2 vibrant and operational. Jim's the C2 portfolio is really where the muscle starts coming in, as far as like, hey, here are the things that we are providing the commander to provide that operational picture so they can make these timely decisions very quickly. Next up, we have Dickie, and Dickie is really, when we start talking about kind of making the analogies piece of data being the blood and C2 being the muscle, transport is the arteries, right? We have to be able to get that blood from the heart to all of the muscles. And in this case, Dickie with transport is going to be it's going to kind of discuss how he envisions, that transport being able to be able to send that data to where it's needed in a timely manner, so the commander can make decisions in order to affect the battle space that he's in. And have the pleasure of introducing Dickie to give us his insight into the transport.
Okay, good morning. I have the honor of having 2 hats on. I am in the plan section at DISA working on the current network, so I have visibility into that. But I also have a second hat on. Is that not on?
Can everybody hear him?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay.
Can everybody hear him now?
So, but I also have a second hat. On. I'm the co-lead for the Transport Working Group. And when they first set up JADC2, they didn't really, their focus was data. You heard them say earlier, LOE1 is,
They're not
still
getting
can't hear? Can't hear?
I killed him.
Let's just, can you slide?
Let's do a switcheroo
No,
with it.
I just killed it earlier.
Let's see. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Hey, Jim, can you just send his mic over?
Yep. Drag it over.
The wire's not going to
You want to switch?
There we go.
Okay. Little technical difficulty.
You got to get up closer.
Get in there, Dickie.
There we go.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay, so I was saying, initially JADC2 didn't have a transport working group. That was set up several months ago because they recognized the importance of just what the colonel said, is, you can have artificial intelligence, machine to machine, all those sexy words that are used when you start talking about JADC2. But without connectivity, you don't have either. So the connection is central to JADC2. And there's several initiatives. I'm just going to touch on a couple of them and some of the traits. First is adaptability. Think of cyber maneuver or software orchestration or multipath routing if you're talking to one of the commercial vendors here. That the ability to dynamically switch to another channel, if you will, if you lose connectivity, right? When you look at both ABMS and Overmatch, they are working some sort of software that does that. Additionally, there's software solutions right here that vendors can talk to you about that do very similar things. SD1 was one mentioned earlier that has that ability, that multipath ability to dynamically reroute. Another thing is resiliency, right? When you talk resiliency, think of CyberMass, think of the mesh and node density, right? A good example of that would be Starlink. And, Elon Musk has about 2,000 satellites up there in orbit. And he even quipped that, if you start shooting my satellites down, I can put them up faster than you can take them down. So the point is, he has mass. He has the ability to keep the network up and in place. A strong mesh is an important element of the network. It's also part of the National Defense Space Architecture that SDA is putting up. In 2024, they're going to put up 126 satellites or thereabouts, or they're going to start working toward that. They have 5 tranches they're going to build, and that is going to be essentially the transport that we'll be leveraging. And think of the vision. Think of, instead of this long tip fed, right? You got to pack all these up. I remember when I was out in the field, you deploy and you had all this Cat 5 bundle everywhere. Gone are all those Cat 5 bundles. Gone are the logistics tells that go with it. Off the plane, you're connected. So that's where we're going with the transport. It isn't going to happen overnight. To get to the data strategy, we would have to collapse, the NIPR, SIPR, JWIC's land structure, and come up with a one network structure, right? Where encryption happens at the edge, where you can even prioritize and have quality of service and push across the network from the edge. But we certainly don't need 3 or 4 different networks. But over time, it's gonna take time to collapse those networks. And so that's where we're trying to go with the group. We got about 130 people working on the group from the COCOM services and agencies, trying to shape what that architecture is going to look like, trying to look at it like Dr. Herman said, from a technology perspective, which technologies have value or might have value. I just talked about SDA's program, but obviously Overmatch and ABMS have some aspects. Obviously, there's some commercial solutions out there like SD1. So the whole purpose is to develop a joint network of the future that has common protocols and common standards.
Thank you, Dickie. And I can't overstress the importance of transport. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations about JADC2, and ultimately the discussion becomes, how do you get information from point A to point B? And so I got a couple of questions that we have before we open it up to the crowd. But the intent is to ask some questions. Like when I formulated these questions, I was like, hey, if I was sitting out there in the crowd, what would I want to know from our panel? because kind of the analogy of a duck is very apropos, because you end up having a situation where it doesn't look like there's a lot going on, but underneath the water's churning all over the place. I will say there's a lot of churn going on with JADC2 as far as like trying to formulate, hey, what is the plan? How do we get from the what to the how? And with that, my first question is to Ms. Kukarski. JADC2 stresses a data-centric design, emphasizing Voltus. It's visible, accessible, understandable, linked, trustworthy, interoperable, and secure. What is your view on how the legacy systems and the future capabilities will achieve the desired data-centric design?
So my view, of course, we're not going to be able to pick up and shift overnight, much like what everybody said, right? So our legacy environments, what they're currently doing, are still vital for us to get to that success mark of what JADC2 is. However, much like everything else, legacy tools have to evolve. And that's what we're here to do with JADC2, is really to take what we're doing now, put in the wouldn't it be cool type of questions, and get to that data exploitation. So I don't see really the legacy things going away. I just see them getting bigger and better. And as an agency, that's where we're trying to really push our industry partners to work with us on that. Letting us know, hey, this is what we currently have in the infrastructure, but now that we know the strategy of what JADC2 is, here's some ideas that we have. Here's what we can bring to the table to help meet that, that success mark. But then also strategizing across this panel, and of course, with other MilDeps and COCOMs who have a very high vested interest with JADC2 as well, is, hey, this is what we're doing in our area. What are you guys doing in your area with your tools? Implementing data mediation practices where you say boat, you say ship, but really it's a vessel, and that's how it needs to be presented in the JADC2. So those decision makers are able to have those information articles from all those different data sets in a understood manner, so that they can make those decisions at the snap of their fingers instead of having to wait hours to get all those different pieces and understand them. So I think really just the evolution of those legacy applications and capabilities into JADC2, that's where we're going with it.
That's great. And I will say, when you really start talking about legacy, we do have a lot of systems in DISA, such as GeeksJ, and Joe's was transitioning to JPEZ. And my next question is for Mr. Fowler. Kind of dovetailing off of the legacy piece. GeeksJ and JPEZ are global force management systems identified for modernization in JADC2. What steps are you taking to ensure the modernization of these programs are adhering to the JADC2 foundational pillars and core enablers?
I mean, if you really start out with some of this, for the foundational pillars, the systems that are there actually already fit some of those. Operationally focused, open architectures. They are basically enterprise systems. Here's kind of the point that I think we're going to be making is JADC2 is also about how do we transition from current to future. Mm-hmm. And part of this is we're looking at it starting with the data perspective, moving away from application-specific architectures to data that can be used across multiple applications. So it's a matter of these systems, how are we going to evolve them? Or how are we going to take pieces, parts from each one of them, evolve them? I just wanted to say for GeeksJ, we're already in the middle of a source selection for the future. But part of it is GeeksJ is already headed toward a more container-based or modular approach. So we're already headed that way in terms of what GeeksJ is doing. GeeksJ has almost always been modular in nature to begin with. I mean, if you really look at it, just because we're in the source selection, some of the numbers I'm hearing is there are already like 300 different parts to it. There are different variants depending on the service, Geeks A, Geeks M. Some of those have basically taken the libraries of GeeksJ and adapted them to their specific environment. What we want to try to do is grow some of those into enterprise services or cloud-based services. It doesn't have to be enterprise CONUS services. It can also be services that are in OCONUS, or actually, hopefully, sometime in the edge nodes for some of this detailed type of processing that we need to do, maybe at the sensor level or at the local COP level. For JOPES, that is already in progress, modernization to a cloud-based, web-based type environment. The system is called JPES. It's the Joint Planning and Execution System. So there are already efforts underway to do some of that work. So now what do we need to do? We need to bring in some of these other tenets in terms of the data services aspect, the cloud services aspect, the data sharing aspect. So some of this is figuring out with our contractors in the future, how do we want to evolve some of these systems or replace parts of them to basically support what the JADC2 tenets are.
Can I just riff on that for a second? I think it's important to understand, if you look at Project Overmatch, if you look at ABMS, there's specific use cases that are intended to connect sensors to shooters. They do that with data that comes out of GeeksJ. So the sensors are aggregated, that data, but the aggregation that we have in GeeksJ is for the purpose of a common operational picture. They're extending that to say that data can also be used to help us connect up the actual systems that come from the sensor to the systems that enable automated response actions. And that's a powerful thing. So becoming a data broker in this space is already happening.
And I don't know, for those who have seen GeeksJ, it's a very powerful tool. I mean, it's to the point now where we have very senior leaders asking for GeeksJ to be put on their desk so they can have that common operating picture that GeeksJ provides. And ultimately, JADC2 is going to kind of build off of that in the future, I believe, to help push that that amount of situation down to other commanders. I want to talk about situational awareness for commanders. The EMS has been something that literally we during the Cold War we were very, very focused on the EMS, and then over time we ended up at least in the Army, we retired all of our electronic warfare systems with the exception of like Crew Duke systems that we used during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But additionally, we pretty much had EMS superiority over the last 20 years in the conflicts that we've been involved in. However, when you start talking about your peer and near peer threats, that is definitely not the case. And there's been a lot of action taking place over the last several years to go back and readdress not only systems that operate in the EMS, but also, hey, how do you get that data from the sensor, which could be an airborne platform, a ship platform, or a ground platform, into a system that could be made sense of by the operational commander in a COCOM. You go look at the Pacific, for instance, right? Hey, there's a lot of water, but there's also land and there's also a lot of airspace, right? So from that perspective, you now start talking about a very joint environment where you need to be able to correlate data from over 3 different sources to include space. So with that, Colonel Johnson, this is the Defense Spectrum lead for the Electromagnetic Spectrum Enterprise Architecture and EMBM. How will the addition of the emerging EMS capabilities enhance the C2 of the commander?
So you talked about a couple of key things as you were going through that. We definitely don't enjoy the space that we've enjoyed over the last few decades, which really drives the need for EMBM and what it will do, and what it will do not only for JADC2 but for a number of other areas. But specific to your question, I would say I kind of started out or left off last time saying that EMBM is our premier C2 EMS contributor to JADC2. I'd also say that that's enhancing the C2 for our combat commanders and our GEMSOCs, because C2 is kind of at the heart of what we're trying to do with EMBM. EMBM is broken out into 4 capability deliverables that I would say. So one of them being situational awareness, which is the one we're working on right now with an IOC focused on September of 22. And we really, situational awareness became that first of the 4 because it was one of the number 1 requests for the combatant commander. So that's important to note that, and as we are looking at these 4 key capability deliveries, we are focused on the things that is important to the combatant commanders. And so situational awareness is the first thing that we're working on to deliver from EMBM. Decision support is also the second thing. That's really about getting the deliberate planning, the JTF deliberate planning process focused capability out to our combatant commanders and our leads. That has already been, that contract has been selected, and we're looking at award of that contract in May of 2022. But our third of the 4 is C2. And C2 is very important, and I think it's still valued, and I think it's an appropriate place because we get an opportunity to really hone the things that we're doing in EMBM before we focus on one of those things that I think is most critical, and that's C2. So that's being the third award and delivery to be determined. And the fourth of capability that we're delivering with EMBM is training support. Again, award and delivery to be determined in the future. Why is all of that important? Overall capability to be delivered by FY24. But some important things I want to get across to the audience here today as we talk about EMBM overall. One, it was mentioned earlier, we're not in the fight alone by Dr. Herman. That is definitely true with the EMBM. We are, Stratcom is our operational sponsor for this capability, and we are definitely focused on partnerships in various efforts. I'll also say that it's important to note that EMBM, I talked about 4 capabilities that we're delivering, but we're delivering it through an agile software acquisition pathway initiative. So we're not talking about getting a complete capability. We're talking about getting the most viable capability release out there and getting it in the hands of the combatant commands. And so that's where it comes down to getting that first delivery out there in September of 22. That's an important one. It's also important that this EMBM focuses on aggregating and fusing EMS data. That's red, blue, white, and gray. So that's our red data, blue coalition, as well as industry data. We're focused also on improving that combatant commander maneuvering, planning, and analytical gaps that have already been identified. And then most importantly, I would say we're looking at advance the EMSO coordination and procedures while enhancing rules of engagement for those combatant commanders. We're going to deliver the operational picture and relevant data that is vital to C2. So I think that's where I'll kind of cut off there in reference to your question about C2. So it's one of 4 focus areas, but it is a critical area that we're developing within the tool set.
All right, thank you. We'll have one more question, and then we'll probably open it up to the floor for 1 or 2 questions from the crowd, and then start wrapping it up. We have talked about the EMS. When you start talking about transport, you're talking about the ability to get information from one point to the other. Either by traditionally that's been wire. I'm an artillery guy. Believe me, I've run a lot of wire over my career. And I will say this, we're increasingly relying on systems that use the EMS in order to get data from the enterprise down to the regional and also to the tactical edge. So from that perspective, I will tell you, you can't talk about this too much until you start talking about operating in a denied, disrupted, intermittent, limited environment. And my question is to Dickie. How do you, in a data-centric design, how do you envision providing the transport necessary to enable the goals of JADC2 in the competition phase where we will have access to a lot of those networks that exist in country, be them commercial, military, whatever. And then as we transition into the conflict phase, which may encounter a DDoS environment.
I guess to put it bluntly, there's nothing like a real world example, right? And so you see in Ukraine that Starlink is there, right? They brought Starlink in. Elon Musk gave them Starlink, and now they have the ability to communicate and connect via a low Earth orbit satellite system. That is where we're going with the transport network. And I already spoke a little bit about that earlier, but then the architecture that supports that's really important as well. And that architecture, the Air Force's chief architect, I read a white paper that he had drafted up, and it's called the Air Force's Ubiquitous LAC Fabric Concept. Okay, and it gets into a little bit of having the one network I talked about earlier, where you can prioritize across and drive a message all the way across the network. That one network is 5G, SATCOM, data links, right? And you're able to go, each node is able to go to the right path based on availability and the quickest path, and it does that dynamically. Okay, now you already see some of this in work already today. If you walk around, you'll talk to them about SD-WAN. That's one thing. You can talk to them about the secure vector routing. That's another thing. But even on the edge, I talked about a little bit about, you know, you have to also have encryption, right? The data owner will drive how it's encrypted, which is much different than the hardware solutions we use today, right? Based on the data that's going to drive across the network, that data owner will select the classified level that should be and drive it to the other owner. So to change over to that, right? To change over to that structure will take time. It'll take investment. And so when we're in this JADC2 working group and we're getting after the DDoS environment that he's talking about, one of the key things is to figure out what that future looks like, right? Begin with the end in mind. And so architectures will help us do that. That's why I think this is key. And again, the premise of one network, right? One network with the right encryption, with the right routing technology to get the message where it needs to be based on priorities, right? That's going to be central to how our networks are going to work in the future.
All right, thanks, Nicky. Hey, we got time. We'll take one question from the crowd. You can go to the mic so everybody can hear you.
Can you hear me? Louder?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. So I would like to just weave one quick question across. Industry would like to help. And so each of you have different areas you talked about where you have needs and requirements. And I think, Colonel, you said MVP, or someone described that. So a lot of capabilities need to be prototype, proof of concept. How can industry come and engage you in an unclassified environment or a classified environment to figure out the art of the possible? I'll just say Starlink had gotten jammed, and yet they were able to respond quickly with a solution and keep going. Cross-domain was mentioned with coalition partners. So there's a whole lot of complexity and a lot of things that were described. I'm just curious how we can come and help each of you.
That's a great question, and you weren't a plant, but you basically made a great segue to my next slide, which is, you know, like, hey, what are some of the Irat recommendations that we could recommend to you in industry to like, hey, here are the things that you need to start looking at in order to start making, start getting your systems JADC2 ready. I will tell you, we need to stop building stovepipes. We need to start building puzzle pieces. Realize that your system or your capability is going to have to plug into something else. It can't be proprietary. It has to be open architectures. You have to be able to accept somebody else's thing into your thing. So from that perspective, and then also realize that the cybersecurity paradigm is shifting. You had Dr. Herman who was talking about zero trust and ICAM. Systems have to be able to accept that. You talked about, before with the enterprise services. How do I get that enterprise service down to the edge? She talked about Ukraine a little bit. I will tell you, she has been pushing enterprise services all the way down to the edge during the Ukraine piece. Data. You can't have your own data format. Eventually we're going to have to be able to figure out a way. How do we all share the same data format? Kind of with the blood analogy, we need to find that O positive data format that everybody can use. And it's really the challenge that we have now is we have a lot. I got A positive, you got B positive. I can't give blood to you, you can't give blood to me, but the O positive guy can give it to everybody. So that's really what we're looking for, as we move forward. From a transport perspective, I think it's all of the above. In the Army, we call it a PACE plan, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. I will tell you, we probably need to have the PPPPP ACE plan, where we look at everything that we could possibly use to get data from point A to point B and don't discount it. I will tell you, I've been deployed a fair number of times over the years, and everywhere that we go, there is some sort of communications infrastructure there. And so from that perspective, we need to be able to figure out how can we utilize that to get our data back from point A to point B. I think we're definitely in a case of, from the transport perspective, all of the above. We talked about Elon Musk and Starlink, but I'm sure there's going to be other things that happen over the years, and when they do happen, we in the military have to be able to take advantage of that. Not only using our own internal military comms, but also using everything else that's available to us. And with that, we are kind of out of time, but I want to give a couple of seconds for anybody who has a word that they want to say as we close up.
I did have one, and again, he wasn't a plant, but that was perfect. From the EMS perspective, I talked about two things that are already underway. The other two are to be continued, right? So from an industry perspective, what we're looking for is any of those vendors out there that have spectrum-related capability, come and give us a demo, especially those who are active in and can leverage AI and ML, or they're doing data mining in the spectrum domain. Those are the areas that are important to us. And lastly, also those that are doing large-scale models and simulations that can incorporate the impacts of EMS considerations on battlefield mission outcomes, as well as C2 concepts and spectrum orchestration. I said that slowly because I hope you were writing. Those are the things we need as we move forward. Hopefully we can get some assistance from you.
Does anybody else have anything they want to use before they close up? Don, I want to thank you again for hosting this, and I appreciate all of us here at DISA having the opportunity to talk to you about JADC2. I hope that the panel members kind of highlighted, and I know from my perspective they did, a lot of the challenges that we have to address moving forward. But there's also a lot of opportunities for industry to start addressing those hard problems that we're going to encounter as we move forward with these working groups and start working the plans on how we move the JADC2 from the what to the how. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. And this is going to be an ongoing conversation over the next several years. But thank you for being on this journey with us.